would not have happened, and it far exceeds anything that we could have expected. So a huge thank you to all of you. Thank you to the university staff and administration who have worked so closely with us to ensure that this event is successful for all of you. And a huge thank you to Creighton University public safety officers, the Douglas County Sheriffs, and the Omaha Police Department who are working to make sure this event's safe. We do also have a few people in the audience that we would like to take a moment to recognize, some elected officials. We have Senator Robert Clements of Nebraska's 2nd District with us. Senator Steve Holleran of District 33. Senator Thomas Brewer of Nebraska's 43rd District. Senator Steve Erdman of Nebraska's 47th District. And Lieutenant Governor Mike Foley is here with us. We also would like to have any member of the United States military please stand and let us acknowledge you and thank you for your service. And if everyone else would please like to join us in standing, Caitlin Mullen, President of Turning Point USA at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, will now lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I know you all are tired of hearing me talk, but I'd just like to say once again, we want to thank everyone for coming. We know a lot of you are huge fans of our speakers, and we can't wait for you to get the chance to hear them speak. We also know that there are some here who do disagree with the positions of our organization or of the speaker, but we are excited to have you here with us, and we're looking forward to a successful event. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to be a model for open discourse and civil dialogue that our society is so currently lacking. With that, I'm happy to introduce the man of the hour. He's editor-in-chief of thedailywire.com and host of The Ben Shapiro Show, the top conservative podcast in the nation. He's the author of 7 books, a nationally syndicated columnist since the age of 17, and a graduate of UCLA and Harvard Law School. He's been described by Glenn Beck as a warrior for conservatism against those who use fear and intimidation to stifle honest debate, and by the Washington Post as a foe of extraordinary polemical agility. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm proud to introduce to you Mr. Ben Shapiro.
Thank you. Wow. All right. Well, that is one hell of a welcome. I guess I'm moving to Nebraska. So number one, I want to thank TPUSA for putting together this event. I want to thank all of you for coming out. I want to thank the university for making sure that we could actually do the event and providing the security necessary to make sure that the event could happen. I only wish that they'd been more quick to ensure that TPUSA could have a chapter over the last couple of years. But that said, it's wonderful that all of you are here. I'd heard a rumor there are some folks who are here who disagree and are intending on getting up and walking out partway into the speech. I would encourage you to stick around and listen. You may actually hear something from which you can learn, or at the very least stick around and ask questions afterwards so we can have a discussion. Well, so tonight, because of everything that's been going on in the nation, Normally, I have my stump speech where I talk about various problems on college campuses, microaggressions and trigger warnings and all the rest. But tonight, because of the serious nature of what's been going on in the country with regard to guns and gun control, I decided that I think it's necessary, because I know the entire nation is listening. I know there are a lot of people who watch this stuff live, who are going to watch this later. And I think it's important that we actually go through the nature of gun rights, the nature of the Second Amendment, and why it is vital that we preserve the right to keep and bear arms. So let me begin with a quick note to all of our friends in the media and to all of our friends on the left. We do care when children are killed. We do care when innocent people are slaughtered. And this notion that if we disagree with you about gun control, this means we're on the side of the murderer is disgusting. Okay, the vast majority of people, I'm sure, in this room are supporters of gun rights. The vast majority of people in this room, I would venture to say everyone in this room, cares deeply and was wounded to the core of them over what happened in Parkland. We all care about innocent people suffering. The question is, how do we prevent that? And just because we disagree with the left on the best way to prevent the evil that happened in Parkland does not mean that we are uncaring or cruel or that we want to see children killed. And I don't care who makes that argument. I understand that there are a lot of people who were victimized in Parkland, people who are survivors of Parkland, and we have nothing but sympathy for them in the suffering that they went through. But being the victim of suffering does not give you the right to say disgusting things. And just because something bad happened to you doesn't mean that you get to go around and say about people who are law-abiding gun owners that they are in league with people who murder children. This makes you part of the problem, not part of the solution. A second note, I think that it's quite ironic that there are so many folks out there in the media who keep looking at Parkland and suggesting that this is a great reason for law-abiding citizens to come up with to give up their guns. So the FBI was warned twice, they did nothing. The Parkland Department was warned about 39 times, they did nothing. There was an armed deputy on scene, he did nothing. There may have been 3 more armed deputies on scene, they did nothing. And the solution is I'm supposed to give up my guns to those people? That's the solution, that I'm going to give up my gun to those authorities? Listen, I love our law enforcement officers, but they can't be everywhere at once, and they can't do everything. Do get made, and holes are sometimes there in the system, and that is why it is imperative that for your own self-defense, there be a right to keep arms, to keep and bear arms. Okay, I want a gun to protect myself and my children and not rely on outsiders who have to arrive after the shooting has begun. Okay, so the way that I'm going to go through this issue tonight on the Second Amendment, I'm going to go through 5 separate aspects of this issue. First, we're going to talk about the constitutional basis of the right to keep and bear arms, what the Second Amendment is actually about, what the Constitution says about it. Then we'll talk about the status of current law, about which the media seems completely unaware. People in the media keep saying things like, you can just walk into a gun shop and buy a gun and walk out. Absolute nonsense. People keep saying things on CNN like you can buy an automatic weapon, no problem. They don't know the difference between a semi-automatic weapon and an automatic weapon, obviously, because that's not the law. And so we'll talk about the status of current law. Then we'll talk about the real statistics on gun violence, where the problem is, what's happened with gun violence, is it going up or is it going down? We'll talk about the effectiveness of particular gun control solutions, and then finally, we'll talk about what we can do. So we're going to cover this comprehensively before we get to the Q&A, which I know is the fun part. But I think it's imperative that we actually get to some of the root issues here. So let's start with the Constitution of the United States. So there's this rumor that's been going around on the left, that the Second Amendment has lived past its use state, that it's expired. There's no reason for us to worry about the right to keep and bear arms anymore. Well, the right to keep and bear arms is undergirded by 2 separate rights, the right to personal self-defense and the right to protect your rights. So the right to self-defense pre-exists government. Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, philosophers who were respected by the Founding Fathers, particularly Locke, talked about the fundamental right of any human being being your right to self-preservation, your right to self-defense. And what Locke had to say about that was that when a government is formed, in a state of nature, you have the right to self-defense. When a government is formed, you don't give up that right to the government. Hobbes thought you give up that right to the government. Now it was the government's job to protect you. Locke said it is the government's job to protect you, but that's just because the government can organize better. You do not give up your personal right to self-preservation when a government is formed. That right cannot be outsourced. It is inalienable. It's the right to life, liberty, property. According to John Locke, and as codified in the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. And it's the government's job to protect those rights, not to take away your own ability to protect your own rights. Okay, the right to protect your rights is the second right that is protected by the Constitution of the United States. Okay, the Declaration of Independence says, whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these rights, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. And the founders were very clear that this right included the ability to have arms. Alexander Hamilton wrote glowingly about the ability of people to own arms in Federalist 46. He praised, quote, the advantage of being armed, which the Americans possess over the people of almost every other nation. He, like all the other founders, saw ownership of arms as a check on tyranny. So, you need a gun for two reasons. One, somebody's coming into your house, you need to shoot them. And two, you have a tyrannical government, and you must have the arms available to form, what they call in the Constitution, a well-regulated militia to prevent government tyranny and to prevent foreign intrusion. Now, the question is, does this logic still apply? Well, obviously, the first logic still applies. If someone's breaking into your house, you still need to be able to shoot them. And very few people will argue this point. Even folks on the left will generally not argue this point. But they say, how can an armed population prevent tyranny? Obviously, the federal government, God forbid, the federal government were to go tyrannical, what could we do as armed citizens to stop any of that from happening? And the answer is, an armed citizenry is the greatest preemptive check on the government going tyrannical in the first place. Meaning the government knows that if they were to go tyrannical, it would be very difficult to disarm all the people of Texas. And one of the reasons that you have a right to keep and bear arms is so that the government cannot take away your right to keep and bear arms, in other words. As to the notion that an armed population can't stop a greater superpower, unfortunately, I would give the examples of Iraq, Afghanistan, Vietnam. The fact is that small arms can make all sorts of trouble for a larger, more well-armed enemy. And it is, again, worth noting that what it's really there for is the deterrent effect. And it has worked in American history before, sometimes for bad and sometimes for good. This is not to say that every use of arms against the government is a good thing. It is to say that if the government were to do something unquestionably evil, that the capacity of the people to stand up for that's a very important thing. And it does have an impact on public policy. Actually, the most recent example is what happened with the Bundy family, where you saw the Bundy family actually checking the excesses of the federal government, and then there was a mistrial in their trial. So basically, the federal government backed off. They were allowed to feed their cattle on what was public land, but they said they had a historic right to use that land, and there was essentially a hung jury. The jury said, okay, well, that's the right. And what happened as a result of all this? It was one factor in an election that brought about a president who decided to scale back the encroachment of the federal government into public lands. There's a history of that. That goes all the way back to the Whiskey Rebellion. And the Whiskey Rebellion, which took place in the late 18th century, that was an armed uprising against the federal government. It was put down. But the effect of it was that John Adams lost the presidency to Thomas Jefferson and the whiskey tax was repealed. So in other words, it's a little bit more complex than the resisting force has to defeat the invading force. It's more about the idea the federal government knows the cost of doing things that are too terrible. And that still holds true. And it's held true throughout history. The idea that a democracy cannot go tyrannical is belied by virtually every democracy in the history of the world, most of which have gone tyrannical at some point or another. And just on a moral level, people should be able to defend themselves against tyranny. And my entire extended family, my grandparents moved here, my great-grandparents moved here, but their extended family remained in Europe. They were slaughtered by the Nazis. I'm not suggesting that if all the Jews in Europe had had guns, they would have been able to stop the Nazis, but I am suggesting they would have been able to kill a lot more of the bastards before things went bad. So folks on the left try to look at the text of the Second Amendment. They try to suggest that the text of the Second Amendment means that there is no individual right to keep and bear arms, right? A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Well, that's a complete misread. Okay? The misread that the left puts on this is that you have to be a member of the militia in order for you to keep and bear arms. This is a complete misread of history. It is utterly untrue. The meaning of this amendment was not in the slightest doubt at the time of the Constitution. At the time of the Constitutional Convention, there are already 8 states that had their own Bill of Rights. All of them guaranteed an individual right to keep and bear arms. One of the chief purposes of that right was to serve in militias that, again, could serve as a check against an overreaching federal government. Virtually all of these state constitutions said the same thing. Here's Pennsylvania's. The people have a right to bear arms for the defense of themselves and their state. In New Hampshire, at the ratification convention for the Constitution, they passed this resolution. Congress shall never disarm any citizen unless such as are or have been in actual rebellion. The text of the Constitution is absolutely clear here. Every time the Constitution says the right of the people to do X, it is an individual right. The right of the people to be free from illegal search and seizure is not a right of us as a collective. It's an individual right against the federal government, as Justice Scalia says in D.C. versus Heller. So what regulations are possible? So the suggestion here is not that you should be able to own a nuclear missile or that you should be able to own a bazooka per se. Right? The suggestion here is that there are certain arms that clearly fall within the ambit of the Second Amendment. So the stupid idea that you've been hearing parroted on the media, that, for example, you don't have a right to a rifle under the Constitution of the United States, that you only have a right to muskets or flintlocks, and the weapons that were available at the time of the Second Amendment, this is just as stupid as saying that Twitter is not protected by the First Amendment because the founders didn't have the internet. What the founders meant is the arms that you need in order to protect yourself and protect your family and protect your community, those are the arms that you can have. And all the other arms might be subject to regulation, because every right that we have has some regulation attached. Like, for example, there are time, space, and manner regulations with regard to the First Amendment. We couldn't just hold this assembly in the middle of the street today, right? There are time, space, and manner regulations with regard to the First Amendment. The same thing holds true with regard to the Second Amendment. There are certain things that can be regulated. So Justice Scalia holds that we can regulate dangerous and unusual weapons, but not weapons that are in common use, which is the current legal standard under the Constitution of the United States. I think that's even a little bit narrow. I think what the standard probably should be is weapons sufficient but not necessary to effectuate the formation of a militia, meaning what weapons you would need to form a militia, but not necessarily every weapon you could possibly want to have. Like, what's the minimum necessary? So this raises the final question on the Constitution. Does the Constitution protect AR-15s? Now, the media has this bizarre obsession with AR-15s, as though AR-15s are the only type of rifle in existence. Number one, the AR does not stand for assault rifle, you morons. It stands for Armalite. Second, if you were to ban the AR-15, there is no way to ban the AR-15 without banning every semi-automatic rifle in the United States, which is to say virtually every rifle in the United States. That does not withstand constitutional scrutiny, nor does it withstand common sense, considering there are 8 million AR-15s in circulation alone. So this is just stupid. And when the left says this, they don't mean it. They're just posturing. When Democrats say this, they're just saying this because they know that it's never going to get voted on, which is why from 2009 to 2011, when they ran the Congress, had 60 votes in the Senate and the presidency, they didn't do any of this stuff. Right? They wait until now to complain about it, so then they can claim that anyone who believes you should have the ability to own a rifle is actually a bad human being. This is the shtick that they're playing. It's really nasty. It's really gross. So, where is the law? What's the law as it currently stands? Because what you hear from the left is that it's easier to buy Sudafed than it is to buy a gun, or that you can just walk around no ID and purchase a weapon. It's the easiest thing in the world to buy a gun. This, of course, is not true. So before I get to what the status of the law is, a few terms that the media might need to know. A semi-automatic weapon is not an automatic weapon. There is also no CNN. There is no such thing as a full semi-automatic weapon. A semi-automatic weapon, for those who don't know, everybody in the audience knows because we're in Nebraska, right? We're not in California, where I live. Note to all of the anchors at CNN, a semi-automatic weapon is a weapon that fires once when you pull the trigger once and chambers around. Okay, that's all a semi-automatic weapon is. An automatic weapon is you hold the trigger down and lots of bullets fire. This is not difficult. Stop misusing the terms. You sound stupid. Okay. When people say assault rifle, an assault rifle generally means a machine gun. These have been illegal in the United States essentially since 1986. Okay, assault weapon is a term that means nothing. Assault weapon is a bizarre legal term of art that means that you add a couple of features to a normal rifle, so you can have a rifle that looks not scary and it's not an assault weapon, and you paint it black and you add a pistol grip and suddenly it's an assault weapon, which is why the assault weapons ban of 1994 made no sense and had no impact on gun violence in the United States. And silencers, the bunch of people who are arguing that silencers are super dangerous and acting like silencers do what they do in the movies, where it sounds like every time you fire a bullet. Okay, that's not what a silencer does. It is still just as loud as a jackhammer. Yeah. Assault, okay, so here is what the law is right now. When it comes to assault rifles, when it comes to machine guns have been effectively banned in the United States since 1986. Technically, legal machine guns must be manufactured before 1986, and the government began keeping track of all sales and manufacture of machine guns in 1934. So it's been a little while since we've had to worry deeply about the threat of machine guns in the United States. Assault weapons were banned in 1994 under Dianne Feinstein's ridiculous law, and that had essentially no impact on overall gun violence by studies, since rifles typically are not used in crime anyway. Rifles are used far less often in crime than handguns are. As far as background checks, to legally buy a weapon, okay, again, there's no such thing as a gun show loophole. To legally buy a weapon from a federally licensed firearms dealer in the United States, you must show ID and you must go through a federal background check. The dealers send your information to the National Instant Criminal Background Check System. There is no loophole here for gun shows. The only quasi-loophole that exists is a private citizen selling a gun to another private citizen. In order to close that loophole, you would have to have a gun registry and identify every gun in the United States, which is probably unconstitutional and certainly is bad policy. Okay, fine. Okay, now let's get to the real gun violence statistics. So what we've been hearing is gun violence is constantly on the increase. People are being murdered on a scale that boggles the imagination. School shootings are increasing, and your child is, if not likely going to die, has a high likelihood of being shot at a school. This is not true. Okay, gun deaths in the United States have been radically declining since 1993. According to the Centers for Disease Control, there were 7 gun-related homicides for every 100,000 Americans in 1993. By 2013, that number had been sliced in half to 3.6 homicides per 100,000 population. During that same period, the number of privately owned firearms in the United States doubled from 185 million to 357 million privately owned firearms in the United States. So the number of arms in the United States was going like this, and the amount of gun crime in the United States was going like that. And yet everybody in the media seems to assume that more guns means more crime. You're going to have to explain then why more guns does not mean more crime. Okay, where do all of these... also, quick note, they say there are 33,000 gun-related deaths in the United States. They neglect to mention that 2/3 of these are suicide. About 8,000, 9,000 gun-related homicides in the United States. The vast majority of gun-related deaths are people who are killing themselves. And it is very easy to substitute another method for killing yourself. Okay. Where do gun-involved deaths take place? So the idea from the left is that states that have lax gun laws have higher rates of gun crime. This is not true. Gun-involved deaths take place in mostly America's major cities. So all those hicks from the sticks, you know, the people who actually own all the guns, those aren't the people who are killing each other. Okay, this is all happening in cities, in major American cities. Virtually all of these major American cities are governed by one party, and I will let you guess which party that is. Almost 60% of all American firearm homicides occur in the 62 cities of the country's largest metros. In order of gun homicide, gun-related death: New Orleans, Detroit, Las Vegas, Miami, Baltimore, St. Louis, Richmond, Memphis, Cleveland, and Philadelphia. That is 9 Democrat mayors and 1 Republican mayor, the only Republican being in Miami. The single strongest predictor of rates of gun death by a wide margin is actually race, unfortunately. Okay, Richard Florida writes, the share of the population that is black is positively related to both the overall rate of gun death and even more so with gun-related homicides. Now, let it be noted, I am not suggesting that black people are inherently more likely to kill each other because that's stupid and racist. What I am suggesting is that culture has a high likelihood of causing homicide. And culture differs. Okay, you can look in poor white communities. There's a higher rate of homicide there as well. Cultural issues and poverty in major American cities factor into gun death. Guns are not the chief reason for gun death. In other words, you need bad people picking up guns in order for those guns to fire themselves. I have 2 guns at home. I have a 9mm and I have a shotgun. Neither one of them has killed anyone. Neither one of them has popped out of my safe and shot anyone. And neither one of them is going to, because it's my safe and I have the key. Okay, rifles versus handguns. People keep talking about banning rifles. The left is very focused on banning rifles, which is a really weird thing to do when you think about it, considering that rifles are not more dangerous than handguns. In 2014, there were 8,100 total firearm homicides. Fully 5,500 were committed with a handgun. 248 total were committed with a rifle. Okay, so you're significantly more likely to die, if you're in a gun-related incident, from a handgun gunshot than you are from a rifle gunshot. And you're more likely to die from a blunt object, from being hit with a fist, than you are to be killed by a rifle. 660 people that year were killed with hands or fists, or feet, like Bruce Lee, right? How about the idea that rifles are inherently more dangerous? Of course, rifles have a greater muzzle velocity. Of course that's true. That's what rifles are made for, but that is not what is predominantly used in crime. And as for school shootings, the idea that school shootings are on the rise is also not true. There was a study that came out just in the last couple of days showing that the number of school shootings has actually been in significant decline. Since 2012, according to the Gun Violence Archive, 138 people have been killed in school shootings. That does include the Parkland Massacre, and it includes any incident that took place on a school campus during times where students or faculty were on the ground. So somebody shot themselves. It wasn't even a mass shooting. It's 138 people total. So between 15 and 20 people per year are killed on school grounds, which means that 2.6% of all youth homicides occur at school. Your child is about 40 times more likely to die from getting into your medicine cabinet or into some other household product than they are from being shot after you drop them off at school, as Leon Wolf points out over at the Blaze. And according to researchers at Northeastern University, mass school shootings are extremely rare. 4 times as many children were killed in schools in the early 1990s as they are today. None of this is to make light of anything that's happened. None of this is to suggest that every school shooting is not a tragedy, but it is to suggest that the lie that is being promulgated out there, that there's a school shooting every day in America. You heard this. There were 18 school shootings, 18 mass shootings in the first month of the new year. It's just not true. It's just a lie. It's made up. Every town for gun violence, for gun safety, puts this stuff out, and it's not true. It's statistically false. Mass shootings more broadly are also not happening all that often in the United States. In fact, on a per capita basis, the United States does not rank number one in deaths from mass shooting in the Western world. Okay, actually, the United States ranks 11th. From 2009 to 2015, here are countries that ranked above the United States in mass shooting deaths rates per million. Norway, Serbia, and France. Mass shooting frequency, we rank number 12, after Austria, France, Switzerland, and Norway. And here's the thing about using mass shootings as a proxy for this discussion anyway. Mass shootings are a really bad way to go about having a gun control discussion because they are not representative of gun violence in totality. The victims tend to be younger. The victims tend to be more racially diverse. The perpetrators tend to be a little bit younger. Most gun murder victims are between the ages of 15 to 34, for example. 2/3 of those gun victims are black in the United States. Okay, in mass shootings, it's racially diverse. So why are we using mass shootings as a proxy to have a discussion about broader gun violence? It doesn't make any sense, except that the media like to choose hotspot, really ugly incidents they can focus on so that then they can claim that all of us don't have sympathy for people who were killed. Okay, now, finally, we get to the key issue, the efficacy of gun control. Does gun control actually stop gun violence? So first, let's point out a quick statistic. Violence statistics, not just gun violence statistics, violence statistics matter. It is true that if you have an armed population, in many cases you have a more polite population. According to PolitiFact, which is a far-left source, for England and Wales, the rate of violent crimes is 775 per 100,000 people. For the United States, that rate is 383 violent crimes per 100,000 people. The UK has double the violent crime rate of the United States, according to PolitiFact, and they have virtually no guns in their society. How about gun control in other nations? What you would expect is, again, this one-to-one correlation, because people keep suggesting over and over and over, more guns means more crime. Okay, let's look at the European countries. Let's take the United States completely out of it. Okay, the gun homicide rate in the United States, first of all, has declined faster than Australia's did after its gun buyback and ban program. And it's hard to measure the impact on mass shootings of Australia's gun buyback program because there were so few mass shootings before that. But if you look at gun control in other nations, right, the Small Arms Survey of 2007 estimates civilian ownership of firearms by nation. The United States ranks by far at the top. We have 101 guns per 100 residents. Number 8 is Norway. Norway has 31 guns per 100 residents. France is 9th. The UK ranks 82nd. So the UK doesn't have virtually any guns. Norway has a lot more guns. Okay, yet Norway is near the bottom of the list in terms of homicide rate, just 0.56 murders per 100,000 inhabitants, and France ranks somewhere near the middle of the pack. They have triple the homicide rate of Norway, but they have way fewer guns, which suggests that maybe this has very little to do with guns, and it has a lot more to do with the population that is in your country. And you see this in the United States too. Right, there are states, there's no correlation whatsoever between a state having a high firearm ownership rate and a high crime rate. So the 10 lowest homicide jurisdictions in the United States are New Hampshire, Vermont, Iowa, Massachusetts, Utah, Minnesota, Maine, Hawaii, Idaho, and Wyoming. 6 of those 10 states earn a D or an F from the Brady campaign on gun control. Meaning if you go to Vermont or New Hampshire, everybody has a gun and there's no gun violence. And the reason for that is because the people in Vermont and New Hampshire are not shooting each other. And this is really not all that difficult. And when you look at the other end of the spectrum, when you look at the states that do have high rates of gun violence, there are a bunch of states, actually, that have a lot of gun control. And of course, everybody in the Second Amendment community is familiar with localities like Washington, D.C. and Chicago. Okay, so with all of this said, what can we actually do? So people on the left like to say that we don't have any solutions here on the right. All we want to do is obstruct. All we want to do is prevent you from doing anything that would really matter. And so we have Jimmy Kimmel out there whining, and we have Jimmy Fallon out there talking about his virtue, and we have Stephen Colbert doing whatever it is that Stephen Colbert does for a living. And we have all of these late-night hosts pretending they know the first thing about guns, which they don't, and pretending they know the first thing about these statistics, which they don't. But they don't have to do the research. After all, they feel the right things. And that's all that matters. They feel correctly. Okay, so what they say is that we don't present any solutions. Okay, so here are a few solutions that people on the right have presented. And they make a lot more sense than trying to ban 300 million firearms in the United States from 100 million gun owners, which makes no sense, is never going to happen, and is just being thrown out there for the sake of making political hay. So one of the proposals that's been put forward is gun violence restraining orders. It's put forward by my friend David French at National Review. Essentially what this would allow is for you, with due process of law, the due process of law, would allow you and your friends to go and you see somebody in your family, a friend who is mentally ill, dangerous to himself and others, you could go to a court, you could petition to have that person's Second Amendment rights temporarily suspended, and it would have to be re-upped on a regular basis with new evidence that this person was still a threat to themselves or others. And this is something that's already been implemented in several states. The second, probably most important thing we could do is actually enforce the laws on the books. We all know about the failures at Parkland, right? How many laws were violated, and yet nothing happened? How many times were we warned about the shooter in Parkland, and yet nothing happened? And this is not uncommon. I mean, the federal government blew it in the Texas shooting. The federal government blew it in Sandy Hook. The federal government blew it in the Charleston mass shooting. Over and over and over, you see situations in which facts were not reported from one agency to the other, and then we're told if we just give them more authority, then everything gets healed. That, of course, is not true. We know that as of 2013, out of 48,321 cases against straw buyers, people who go in and falsely purchase a gun in order to hand it to somebody who can't legally have a gun, out of those 48,000 cases, the federal government had prosecuted 44. 44. And then they talk about they need more authority. They can't even handle the authority they have. As of 2013, there were 20,000 people in my stupid state, California alone, who were not legally allowed to own guns, but owned them anyway. And at the time, the state of California had staffed, I believe, 30 people to go out and remove 20,000 guns from these folks. Good luck on that. States also are not reporting people who should be barred from owning and buying guns to the feds. 38 states submit less than 80% of the records that they are legally bound to submit to the federal government. Okay, so with all of this on the books, you need to actually enforce the laws on the books before you claim that you have a lack of authority. Okay, here's something else that can be done, and this is what I've called on the media to do. Studies suggest that mass shooters are generally egged on by media coverage. So over-the-top media coverage, lots of coverage of the shooter, using the shooter's name, using the shooter's picture, talking about every aspect of what the shooter wants you to talk about. This causes people to obsess, mentally ill people to obsess, and then to go out and commit mass shootings. So what we at the Daily Wire have done is we won't show the names and we won't show the faces and we won't talk about the identity of mass shooters. We should have adopted that policy a long time ago, but we reconsidered our position in the light of new evidence and some of the studies that have come out, and so now we're doing it. So the question is, why aren't the mainstream media even considering it? Why is it the same mainstream media who are willing to sit by and watch Senator Rubio get slandered on national television as akin to a mass shooter? Those same people who are willing to sit by and listen as shooting survivors talk about how members of the NRA are evil and want to kill children, those same people will show every single day a picture and name of a mass shooter in Parkland. There's something they can be doing, and they're not doing it right now. So why don't the media actually put their money where their mouth is instead of just relying on the government to fill the gap they think ought to be filled? Conservatives obviously have talked about heightened school security, from arming qualified teachers, not every teacher, qualified teachers. I mean, Coach Aaron Feist died throwing his body in front of bullets. It would have been better if he'd been armed. I think that's rather uncontroversial. Okay, people should not have to throw their bodies in front of bullets. They should be able to have the capacity, if they are qualified, to have a gun to protect themselves. Heightened school security is a necessity. I went to a private school in Los Angeles. My private school in Los Angeles, the Jewish Day School, it was located next to the Holocaust Museum on Pico Boulevard. And in 1999, there was a mass shooter, and the mass shooter drove past our high school and saw that we had armed guards, saw that the museum had armed guards, and he just kept driving. He drove over to a JCC that had no armed guards and proceeded to shoot up the JCC. The point there being that, I was at the school at the time, the point there being that school security actually does dissuade mass shooters very often from doing what it is that they are seeking to do. And I don't mean one armed security guard, I mean a lot of armed security guards carrying and walking around the halls and all this nonsense from the left. Oh my God, if a kid sees a gun, they're going to be scarred for life. I'll tell you what's a little more scarring. Okay, there are a few things that are a little more scarring than seeing law enforcement officers walking around your school, maintaining law and order, and ensuring that nobody walks in with a gun. Okay, one of those things is a mass shooter coming in there and murdering children. A little more scarring, I would think. And finally, and this is a bigger issue, we do need a mass awakening with regard to morality in this country. One of the things that is creating One of the things that's creating this spate of dispossessed young men, disillusioned young men who are walking to schools and shooting people up, yes, a lot of these folks, a disproportionate number of these folks, are growing up in single-parent families where the father is not present in the home. But more importantly, we as a culture have denigrated manhood. We've denigrated what it means to be masculine, what it means to be a man. It's so funny. There's a lot of talk these days about rape culture and Me Too and Time's Up and all of this. And what we keep hearing from people on the left is teach your boys not to rape. Now, I would like to see a show of hands, a lot of young men in here. I assume that none of you are rapists. If you are, please leave or turn yourself into the police. But I assume that of all of you who have not raped anybody, show of hands, how many of your parents said to you, do not rape? Like actually said those words to you, do not rape. Right? Nobody. And yet, magically, no one in here is a rapist. Okay, so this do not rape nonsense is a failure. What your parents probably did teach you is be a gentleman. Protect women. Protect children. It is your job to be the sheepdog, right, in the American sniper model. It is your job to be a protector. Part of being a man means protecting other people, not being a victimizer and not being a victim. Conservatism needs a resurgence because morality and virtue have been completely lost in our public debate. These things have been put to the side. We've been told that the government can fill every gap. The government can save you from every bad thing that's going to happen to you. It can't. A virtuous citizenry, an armed virtuous citizenry, is the most dangerous thing to both tyranny and vice. An armed virtuous citizenry is what stands between civilization and darkness. But both of those things have to be true. You need an armed citizenry, but that citizenry can damn well be virtuous. And that's where it comes in. That's where we have to do better in teaching our own children. That's where conservative morality matters. That's where Judeo-Christian values matter. That's where the use of reason matters. That's where we have to stop teaching our children that they're victims of the system and start teaching them that responsibility starts with them. And they have to take responsibility for their own actions. Virtually no evil human being in the history of the world has thought that they were an evil human being. Virtually every human being who is evil, who's done true evil to another human being, thinks that they were a victim. We need to stop growing a society of victims. We need to stop telling kids that they are victimized. We need to stop telling kids that they don't have an obligation to overcome whatever obstacle they are facing with our help, and then go forward and do something great, like protecting innocent people. If you don't give young men something valuable to do, they will do something very bad. I have a 2-year-old son. He does 2 things. He builds with his blocks, and he knocks them over. Okay, this is true of every man who has ever been created. Okay, men only do 2 things. They build or they destroy. And if we are not teaching young men to build, they will destroy. So bottom line, I think we can come to some solutions across the aisle. I think that we can agree on a lot of the things that I've talked about if people are willing to put aside the partisan political bickering, if they're willing to put aside the virtue signaling and the moral posturing and get past the idea that people who disagree with them on policy are nasty human beings, because these seem relatively uncontroversial. Teaching men to be better human beings, arming school guards, ensuring that mentally ill people with due process cannot get guns, right? Doing all of those things, these should be no-brainers. And yet we're stuck. And the reason we're stuck is because there are too many people who, for their own purposes, feel better about themselves if they can castigate you as bad people because you own a gun, or because you've once fired a gun, or because you know what a gun is. And this is coming from a person who grew up on the coast and did not own a gun until I was 23 years old. Right? The reality is the people on the coast, unfortunately, and especially in the media, have a severe cultural dislike for people who know and like guns, who have grown up with guns, who know how to defend themselves. That has to stop. Because we can't come to any agreement on what to do until we can come to an agreement that we are all members of the same American family and that we all want the same thing, to protect innocence and to promulgate virtue. Thanks so much. Happy to take your questions. So, now for the fun part. So, I have a standing rule in my lectures. If you disagree with me on any topic, and it doesn't have to be about guns, obviously, let's talk about other fun things. if you disagree with me, raise your hand. You go to the front of the line automatically. Because, number one, you're brave for being here, so you should get the privilege of skipping the line.
That's right. Oh, we're going here first? Okay.
All right.
All right.
So I do happen to disagree with you. I voted for the president, I'm a member of the NRA, and I'm a huge fan of yours, but all three of you have said that bump fire stocks need to be illegal. And it seems that banning bump fire stocks on the basis that nobody really needs them is the same kind of logic that leads to saying that we should ban AR-15s or ban semi-automatics or ban certain magazines because nobody really needs them. Does it all worry you that that kind of mentality that, oh, well, if you don't need it, it's okay to get rid of it, can lead to further gun control?
So the answer is yes. If rationale on bump fire stocks, I would think my rationale was stupid. So I think that argument, you don't need it, therefore you don't have a right to it, is one of the worst arguments about rights ever. Right? You don't need virtually anything in this world, but you have rights to lots of things, thank God. The reason to ban bump fire stocks, first of all, I'm not sure it's going to be effective because you can manufacture a bump fire stock very, very easily. Or you can just bump fire a rifle without actually having a bump fire stock. But if there is a case for banning a bump fire stock, whatever that case may be, the case would be that machine guns in the United States are already illegal and that they ought to be illegal, and so anything that simulates the firing mechanism of a machine gun should be illegal. That's the case. Okay, the case is that machine guns are illegal, so anything that makes a semi-auto fire like an auto should also be illegal. I'll acknowledge that I think that there is a weak case for firing, for banning bump stocks, but I don't think the case is the one that you're making. In other words, I don't think it's a matter of I don't need it, therefore you can ban it. As I say, you don't need Twitter, but I think you have a right to use it. And we might all be better off if we didn't, but that's another story. Thank you.
Okay, testing. Okay, good. All right, Shapiro, I've got two questions for you. One, just to get the nerves out, and second one's going to be a bit important. First, do you know a YouTuber by the name of Secular Talk, Kyle Kalinske?
No, I don't actually.
He was on Joe Rogan's podcast, and I think it would be interesting if you two debated each other.
Okay, I'll take a look.
Okay, thanks. All right. And then the second one. The second one's a bit critical. Shapiro, you've shown disdain for the people who have called you and a lot of your remarks bigoted, and you make it one of your hallmarks, right? Like, if someone calls you a sexist, racist, bigot, homophobe, you can't take that. You have to, fight back immediately. Yet, you call these claims against you preposterous, but yet considering the fact that, A, while you were an editor-at-large at Breitbart, they called people like Bill Kristol a renegade Jew. Also,
That was after I left, actually, but...
What did you say?
That was after I left.
Okay. And also, touting...
Sorry, go ahead.
Okay.
No, it's fine.
Also counting Jewish leaders as neocons, something that you yourself have said is an anti-Semitic slur. Also, when you resigned, you just saw the infamous poster that they put on you. They put your face into the David Star. Also, you initially defended a video of your own creation. Not of your own creation.
It was not my creation, yeah. The
Columbus
Day video, yeah.
Mm-hmm. The Daily Wire's, you defended that initially. That video where you defended that as satire. Of course, the infamous video of Native American people, their genocide.
Yeah, the video's garbage.
Justified.
Right.
And then finally, and most infamously, you said that Arabs, not Islam, were, quote, your words, were the darkness in the Middle East, were rotten to the core. And most infamously and horribly, you said Arabs like to bomb crap and live in open sewage.
Okay, so can I address those one at a time? Okay, so let's go through them one by one. So, so let's start with the last one, the bomb crap and live in open sewage. Go back and look at the entire Twitter thread. I was specifically talking about the leadership of Hamas. I actually say that in the thread, in the next tweet. So I don't believe that all Arabs like to live in open sewage and bomb crap, obviously. I think there are millions of Arabs, I actually say in that thread, in that exact same thread, that there are millions of Arabs across the Middle East who are wonderful people, and there are many millions of Muslims who are wonderful people. So, again, that one's out of context. As far as the Columbus Day video, what happened is that I was on vacation, and I got news that this thing had broken. And I looked at it, and it looked to me like a bad video, but a satire video. And I'm always hesitant to pull down satire, just as a general rule, because I think that once you start pulling down satire, then you are opening yourself up to the charge that anything that is intended to be humorous is supposed to be taken at face value. So my initial response was very torn. And over the course of the next 24 hours, the more I looked at it, the more I thought it was garbage, and the more I thought that the comedic value of it was dramatically outweighed by the nastiness of it. And I took the hit myself, and I took it down. Right, so there's that. As far as the column where I talked about darkness in the Middle East, what I specifically was talking about, again, that's taken out of context, is about a column. It was a column with regard to the Palestinian Authority and the fact that if you were to juxtapose Israeli settlements to the Palestinian Authority, then what you would be looking at is a regime that is terroristic and supports terror attacks and supports tyranny and supports the imprisonment of gay people and does not support women's rights. And you're looking on the other side at a regime, at a state that supports all of the same values that we in the West value. So I think it's important that we actually give full context to each of those remarks. Again, the reason that I fight back on the racist, homophobe, bigot charge is because if you're going to call me that without evidence, then you're a jackass. And if you're going to take my stuff out... And taking context and I'm not suggesting this is what you're doing. My guess is that you're probably getting this off a list that was provided by some group or another. But if that's the case, then pulling quotes out of context and then using these as bludgeons without actually looking at what I was saying is a cheap trick.
Okay. Just two things I want. First, they weren't meant to use as bludgeons. One of the points that I wanted to make when I came up here was the fact that, it's pretty obvious I'm on the left, is that in terms of the left...
It wasn't obvious to me until you started talking. You see, because I don't assume that just because you're black, you're on the left.
Yeah, pretty brutal. Yeah, I just...
Racist, see. You see how that worked? Go ahead.
Okay. All right. I'll be...
No, it's fine. Go ahead. I want to hear the end of what you were having to say. I don't just want to...
Yeah. Okay. I just wanted to... While it may seem confrontational, I wanted to talk to you about that. Like, if you fully explain those to me, then I would. I mean, I wouldn't be out here if I thought you were some intrinsically evil person that...
Well, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I do. No, really, I do.
Like,
I'm being serious and not facetious.
Yeah, I would want to discuss. Because I think that, in a large part, you're one of the more important conservative voices there. Like, what I would say is that just often that there's a lot of people in government, our president, who have made questionable choices as regard to saying things about race. And I think,
I do not disagree with you.
Yeah. And I would want that if you, someone who's seen as a rational conservative, if you've made remarks similar to that, then I would want to at least discuss that.
Yeah, no, I totally appreciate the opportunity to do that, so thank you.
Hey Ben, I just want to say it's a pleasure to finally meet you and see you at Creighton. My question is, growing up on a Native American reservation in California and being one of the only few conservative Native Americans I've seen on reservations, I've seen the complete dependence on government, from healthcare to food commodities to the land we live on. Many people on the reservation are completely dependent on the government, and it creates a reliance, and I see even a division among us. I believe it divides many Native Americans from the rest of the outside world. Also, we fought so hard to be free from government control, and now it seems that most Native Americans and a lot of minorities vote so liberally and want the government involved in like every aspect of their lives. So my question is two parts. Number one, should we get rid of the reservation system? And two, how can we return Native Americans and other minorities back to a more conservative/libertarian mindset?
So I'll admit to some ignorance on the workings of the reservation system, just to start. From what I do know, my feelings on the reservation system are secondary to my feelings that you as an individual should make decisions in your own life about whether you want to live on a reservation or whether you want to move out of a reservation and live in an area that's not so dominated by the federal government.
Yeah, that's what we did, as our family did, because we didn't like independence.
Yeah, and so I'm not going to speak to tribal sovereignty because I frankly don't know. I think that the original idea of granting tribal sovereignty to tribes that had been displaced was not a bad one. I don't think that that was a necessarily bad idea from the beginning. I do think that the reservations are horribly run by the federal government because the federal government is terrible at everything. Anything that forwards individual self-reliance, in other words, I think is going to be a better solution. And I don't know that that has to do specifically with the idea of reservations being outside the purview of state government, or if it has more to do with just a culture that has been created in every area across the United States, reservation, non-reservation, in which people are dependent on government. And once you're dependent on government, you're used to being dependent on government, and that creates a sort of enervation of the population that's a problem.
Thank you.
Thanks.
What's up, Ben? Sorry, it's a little low here, brother. First off, I want to preface this with, it was 9:15 and 37 seconds before you came in here.
That's not my fault, man.
And I have no water. Oh my God.
Well, you know what? I fasted today, so I beat you there. It's a
don't know.
Jewish fast day.
You
So.
got me on that one. But I do want to say, you were speaking a lot about guns and gun control, and you spoke about the black population and whatnot. Look in the front row. Do you see anybody? There's 8 rows here. Do you see any black Americans?
I mean, since I'm not blind, no.
Yeah.
I mean,
and there's a thing to it, and I agree with you on a lot of things, but at the same time, like, what do you see as a solution? You always talk about a solution, like, come up with something that is understandable.
sure.
Do you have any ideas? Like, what would you put in place?
To stop, to do what? To stop gun violence, or to change cultures of poverty that exist both? I'm sorry.
Yeah, because
So, I mean, so the answer, the answer
I
that
don't think it's a gun problem. I think it's a social problem.
So,
like,
I agree with you.
What do you see?
So what I see as the problem is if you want to connect factors that lead to crime, intergenerational poverty, single motherhood, a lack of fathers in the home, these are factors that connect, just statistically speaking, in very high fashion to crime rates. And these are also decisions that are made on an individual level that can be changed. Meaning that if you grew up in a single mother home, there's nothing you can do about that. Obviously, it's not your decision, it's not your choice. But what you can do is break that cycle for the next generation, and we're not actually seeing that. Right? We're actually seeing this in the white and the black communities, and it's a real problem. We're seeing that in 1960, for example, the white single motherhood rate in the United States was 5%. Today it's 40%. In the black community, it was 20% in 1960. Today it's 70%. Okay, that is not the right direction. And it means that despite all of the growth in the economy, despite the fact people are much richer than they were in 1960.
Handgun rates are much higher than AR, which is...
What was that? I'm sorry?
Handgun rates are much higher than an AR, which is...
Right. But again, I don't think that it's a matter of...
Like, what would you
So my solution,
suggest?
as I said, is people making more virtuous decision on an individual level. It's not that a black person gets a hold of a gun and the gun starts going off on its own.
Amen.
Right? What happens is that there is somebody who's making a bad decision with a gun. And usually there was a series of bad decisions that led up to that bad decision. As I've said many times, if you want to actually alleviate poverty, if you actually want to alleviate crime, one of the things that you're going to have to do, here are 2 quick solutions, okay? Solution number 1 is that on an individual level, people need to make 3 choices, okay? If you do these 3 things, you will not be permanently poor in the United States. According to the Brookings Institute, 2% of people who have made these 3 decisions are permanently poor in the United States. That's it. Everybody else out of poverty. Okay, these people don't have babies before they're married. They graduate high school, and they get a job. Doesn't matter what the job is. Those 3 things, you won't be permanently poor in the United States. So you start with that. Okay. The next thing that you do, and this is really important, the next thing that you do is you dramatically increase police presence in high crime areas. You don't decrease it. You don't suggest, as Black Lives Matter does, that you ought to take the cops out of the streets where the most crime is happening. You make it safe for businesses to come in and invest. You make it safe for people to come and move in. You raise property values.
Good job. Hey.
The cops are not the problem. The cops are the solution.
Hey, Ben. Air high five.
All right, fine. Okay.
Hello, Ben. I don't want to get emotional here, but I lost my father to heart failure 6 months ago, and I've been looking up to you to get my values, so thank you about that. I mean,
Well, I'm not going to be able to fill those shoes, but thank you. That means a lot to me.
yeah. So, Ben, I'm having a great time with no melting snowflakes, screaming and getting little air trumpets and just doing whatever. But given the current political climate change in high schools and universities, what is the best recommendation for entering the college scene in 2 years?
So I think that actually recommend, I think that it's actually a good thing. When conservatives go to leftist universities, I think it can be a very good thing if you are conservative going in. I think if you do your reading, it can actually turn coal into diamond. So I went to UCLA, I went to Harvard Law School. There's a combined total of one conservative between them, me. Right? The number of there are not a lot of conservatives at UCLA. It's not really famous for it, and Harvard Law School has generated a bunch of late leftist Supreme Court justices. So with that said, I think that it was a good battleground. It's a good testing ground for discussion and argument. As you may notice, I really enjoy discussing things with people on the other side. I actually enjoy throwing around ideas. It makes my ideas stronger. Sometimes they make a point that I think is a really good one, and I think that we all ought to be having those discussions. But it means you have to do your reading. So you can choose the hard path, or you can choose the easy path. The easy path is you go to a place that's more conservative. You go to a Hillsdale College or a Liberty University, right? You go to some place that is just by nature more conservative, more focused on Western civ, and that's great. I mean, I love all those places. The other choice is that you go into the belly of the beast and you realize that most of your education is going to be stuff that you undertake on your own. That your professor is going to assign you a bunch of stupid commie literature, he's going to assign you Howard Zinn, and then it's going to be your responsibility to go read a bunch of Larry Schweikart and Paul Johnson in response. And it doubles your reading load, but it also means that you're going to know their arguments better than they know your arguments, than they know their own arguments by the time they're done.
Thank you.
Hi, Ben. First, thank you for coming out. I'm a huge fan, but I also disagree with about like 70% of what you said tonight. But
Well, thank you for coming out with
I
that.
know, and I am a huge listener of your podcast. I think it's really important to listen to people who have different opinions than you. A lot of my leftist friends very much disagree with me if I try to bring up anything from another side. My biggest critique of the left is that they do that thing where you think one thing that they disagree with, and so you're grouped into a whole group. So it's kind of like, oh, you take money from the NRA, you support the killing of children. I'm not a fan of the NRA, but I don't think that everyone who takes money from the NRA wants children to die. So I guess like my question for you is, as someone, I'm a sophomore at the University of Kansas, which is a very leftist school. Yeah, rock chalk. But how do I go about, I guess, like finding some middle ground? I think like it's either like you're a snowflake from the right, or it's like you hate everyone and are, you know, just a racist, transphobic, horrible person.
Right.
And I don't think that it's true on either sides. How do I go about finding some middle ground?
So I most people are somewhere in the middle. I think that most people are not on either of these polls, which is why I think we've built a pretty big audience, and I think people like Jordan Peterson have built a big audience, and people who I disagree with, but who are attempting to say true things. You know, Sam Harris, I disagree with him on everything. But I think Sam is somebody who actually tries to use reason to get at the truth, and so I can have a rational, decent conversation with Sam, right? And I think that's a productive thing. I think most people in America are looking for that. I think there's a group of people who are on the internet doing this. I think Joe Rogan does it too. I think there are a lot of people who do this, but I think that the tendency in the media is to focus on what works best for a 3-minute segment between talking heads, which is them clubbing each other. And so what I would suggest to you, and I suggest to everybody, is in the first 5 minutes of a conversation, you know whether this conversation is productive or not. If it is not, leave. Really, like you just don't have enough time in your life. There are only a certain number of breaths you're going to be able to take, and when you're on your deathbed, that 45-minute conversation with the person calling you a baby killer is probably not going to be something that you think was a good use of time. So, you know, try and identify the people who you're getting something from the conversation, and they are too, and be honest with yourself about what the purpose of the conversation is. Is it to convince them? Is it to sharpen your own views? Be rational about your approach to conversation. By the way, this is a good rule for life. I do this with my wife all the time. When my wife has a problem, I have a very basic rule, which is I ask her if this conversation is about me listening or me solving the problem. And it's a very good rule for relationships. It's also a good rule for life. Try and determine what the purpose of the conversation is before you engage in an hour of it.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Awesome, thank you.
Hi, Ben. I'd like to thank you for coming and just being someone that can represent conservative values in a way that makes sense to everyone. I kind of have 2 questions. The first one is I'm holding this book that you once called Thorough. It's called Reasons to Vote for Democrats. And I was wondering if you'd be willing to sign this book for me.
No, Michael Knowles is the worst, man.
Okay. Valid point. Then my second question doesn't have anything to do with guns, just something I know you've said before. It's true that you've said you're pro-death penalty?
Yes.
Okay, so that's something that I would say I agree with you on probably like 98, 99% of things you say. But as a practicing Roman Catholic, I'm very pro-life in every sense of the way. And I'm just wondering how you can be like you can say you're pro-life for like abortion, but yet you're pro-death penalty, and how you can still be pro-life in that.
Yeah, I mean, the easy answer is because babies in the womb haven't raped anyone.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the very basic answer. And that, as a fellow religious person, the language that is used in the Bible and the Ten Commandments is not the language "do not kill." It's "do not murder." It's an actual different word in Hebrew, right? Taharog means don't kill, and tirtzach means don't murder. The language in the Ten Commandments is tirtzach, meaning don't murder, and so that's not the same thing. As far as the death penalty, I think there's two questions always with the death penalty. One is, in principle, are you against it? So for you, in principle, you're against it, and that's an interesting discussion. And then the second conversation is the one people always want to have, which is the effectiveness of the death penalty, whether it is evenly applied, and that's a different conversation to me, and I think there are good criticisms to be made about how we apply the death penalty in this country. People sitting on death row for 13 years before they're executed, people who've been exonerated on death row. Like there are questions to be asked about how we administer the death penalty, but on principle, I am pro-death penalty, even if in application I have some questions about it.
Okay. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks.
Hi, Ben. I have a comment followed up by a question. First, I was someone who, after the last presidential election, that night I did not understand how Hillary Clinton was losing. I voted for her, and I was very confused by the whole thing. And after that happened,
Donald Trump felt the same, by the way.
Good.
I mean, let's be real about this. That was kind of shocking.
But after that happened, I started following a lot of people like you and Dave Rubin and Joe Rogan and trying to kind of understand how it all could have happened, what happened. And with that in mind, I kind of have a question, kind of a hypothetical. So I know that you were not pro either of the presidential candidates in the last election. You thought they were both they both sucked.
For lack of a better word, yes.
Yeah. So with that in mind, if you lived in a state where your vote mattered, obviously you live in California, is there anything that a Republican could do and or a Democrat candidate could do that would make you vote for a Democrat? As in, like, a Republican does something, you say, I can no longer support that person, I would vote for the Democrat, or something Democrats could do to pull you in, maybe for just one election.
Okay, so there's only a couple things that I can think of that would happen. One would be if I really thought that the threat of a Republican, let's say that the Republicans ran somebody who I really thought was a threat to become a full-on tyrant, right? Somebody who was just so morally abhorrent and awful that I thought that the entire structure of the country was in danger, then you vote for whatever you have to do to stop them. I know there are a lot of people who felt that way about Hillary Clinton, which is why they voted for Trump. So there's that. And there are a lot of people, by the way, who voted for Hillary Clinton who felt that about Trump. So this is one of the problems with our politics. The other thing that could happen is that presumably a Democrat could actually outflank a Republican on some of the key issues that I want, but they'll never do this. Right? So long as Democrats are rabidly and thoroughly pro-choice, I'm not going to vote for a Democrat. Right? So long as Democrats think that it's okay to kill a baby up to point of birth, the answer is no. So I said this on my show, like with regard to Judge Roy Moore in Alabama. If I had lived in Alabama, I wouldn't have voted for either candidate, but I wouldn't have voted for Doug Jones just because I didn't like Roy Moore. Doug Jones was a pro-abortion guy. So I always think there's a third option, and that third option is both of these people suck, I'm not going to vote. And you have to gauge that independently. Like, my calculus would probably be different today than it was even when the election happened, because now we have a year of Trump's governance, so I get to look at what he's done. Do I like it? Do I not like it? It's a different record, at least in legal terms, than it was about him as a character. He was much more of a cipher when the election happened than he is now. He's basically fulfilled what I thought of him in terms of character, unfortunately, in some ways. But I think that in terms of legislative policy, he's wildly exceeded what I thought he was going to do. He's been much more conservative. Mike Pence's policies have basically come out of the Trump administration. Unfortunately, Trump's Twitter feed also has.
Quick little question off of that. If there was like a pro-life Joe Biden someone like Joe Biden who was pro-life running against Donald Trump, would you in any way consider the Joe Biden-like candidate?
I mean, I have to a candidate is on the table, but then I would have to look at all the other issues that are. Then you're at least operating from a position of mild or closer to parity, because he's not crossed one of my absolute red lines. There may be other red lines that he crosses, and so I have to look at all the issues and kind of judge it on that basis.
Thank you, Ben.
Hey, so I have a question based on a previous video of yours. So in the video, you disproved the myth that the radical Muslims are a minority. So in light of that video, what do you think about immigration, specifically Muslim immigration into the U.S.?
Right, so the video is called The Myth of Tiny Radical Muslim Minority. And what it does, it takes a bunch of opinion polls from Pew Research and looks at how many Muslims in a particular country, because they did it in Afghanistan and Iraq and various other countries. And then they looked at how many people support honor killings, how many people support terrorism, how many people think that the Jews were behind 9/11, and it attributed radicalism to people who fulfilled these categories. And when you look at the polls, it's a pretty significant population. And so I know that PolitiFact has argued with this, but PolitiFact's own calculations come up with something like 18% of the Muslim population globally is radical, according to PolitiFact, which seems to me low, but is still incredibly high. That's still, 200 million people. So the answer as far as Muslim immigration is I don't think that we should have a global ban on Muslim immigration, but I do think that we obviously have to have some pretty rigorous ideological standards for people who are entering the country. And that is not unique to Muslims. That should hold true for anyone, because there are a lot of countries that are not fluent in Western values, and people who grew up in those cultures are going to have to prove that they deserve to be in the country. So if you fulfill that standard, then you should be allowed to come in. There's a difference. There are Reform Muslims and moderate Muslims. I don't care that somebody wears a hijab. I wear a funny hat on my head too. Right? It doesn't bother me at all. And I'd be a hypocrite if I were to say that you wear a hat that people think is weird and therefore you shouldn't come in, like I wear a little beanie, right? So that would be silly. But I do think that obviously when you're talking about countries where it's very difficult to vet people from these countries, it's very difficult to do a background check. There are no good criminal background records. And there's no history of assimilation, then you have to be a lot more skeptical on average of people from those places than you would be of people from different places.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Mr. Shapiro, my name's Dakota, big fan. I'd like to thank you for your time. And my question, are you very familiar with the idea of implementing a carbon tax in the form of a carbon dividend program?
I'm familiar with it. I haven't really studied it in the depth that I would like to comment authoritatively on it. My feeling is that when it comes to global warming, as a non-climate scientist, what I will say is that even if you accept the IPCC's estimate that over the next century, the climate is going to rise by something like 4.7 degrees Celsius, or whatever they say it's going to be, 7 degrees Fahrenheit, something like that, on average across the globe. The solution is not necessarily regulation. It's quite possible that the solution is technological in nature, meaning that emissions in the United States have dropped and were dropped before the implementation of CAFE standards, for example. Newer technology tends to be more energy efficient, which means it tends to be greener. And so the idea that the government has to come in and put a cap on everything and that's the best way to stop carbon emissions, I'm not sure that there's a good, effective case for that. Now, as I say, I'm open to the idea. And Milton Friedman was open to the idea. I'm not closed off to the idea itself, but my tendency is always to err on the side of the free market, which tends to solve a lot of these problems rather than implementing something from top down.
What about the idea that these carbon emissions and other pollution are there externalities that aren't covered by the free market?
Yeah, that's why I'm saying I'm open to it, because environmental problems are by nature not covered by the free market in the sense that they create externalities.
Yeah.
Government has a role in regulating externalities, right? I get to wave my fist around until I hit you in the face. Well, in environmental terms, I get to pollute on my own property, but not if it goes on your property or into the air at large, which is why we have environmental regulations. I'm not against all environmental regulations. My question is, and again, I'd want to study it more deeply, how do you tailor regulations in the best possible way so as not to impede economic development while also protecting the environment, which I think we all want to do, right?
Yeah, exactly. So what the idea of this tax would be a tax that is implemented upon the source or the basically.
I know what a carbon tax is, and in California, it hasn't been particularly effective there. I'm open to the idea that maybe it'll be more effective on a broader scale, but one of the big problems that you have is that we implement carbon taxes in the United States, and China's not implementing carbon taxes, and India's not implementing carbon taxes, and so how much are you?
China's investing more in renewable energy than the United States currently.
I'm sure they're investing more in renewable energy. They're also polluting more than we are.
Yeah.
Not on a per capita level, but on a global level. So
historically, the U.S. has produced 27% more than any other country combined.
Yeah, developing countries do, right? Strong economic countries tend to pollute more. So the question is now, is it going down, or is it stagnating, or is it going up? And many of the things that have been helping out are things that the left opposes, like fracking, which has been much more environmentally friendly than traditional drilling, for example. Natural gas has been much more much more environmentally friendly than oil.
Okay. All right.
Great, thanks.
Hi, Ben. Two questions. First one, do you think partisanship is wearing down on the checks and balances system?
Yes. I think the checks and balances system has basically been destroyed in many ways. I think that the legislature has thrown its power over to the executive branch, and the executive branch has become far too powerful through the bureaucracy at the expense of the elected legislature, and people in partisan positions feel the necessity to do that because if it's a Republican president, they'll just toss all the responsibility over there and everything will be fine, and vice versa.
Right. Okay, and then given the state of the top tier of our criminal justice system, what would you think about the Attorney General being elected by the governors of the 50 states and somebody like Puerto Rico?
Well, I think the problem is that you do have to. I think that backdooring a checks and balances system is not the answer. I think the constitutional structure in which there was a unitary executive and the Attorney General is answerable to the unitary executive makes a lot more sense. And that way, if the President of the United States is mishandling the DOJ, then the proper solution is impeachment. I'm not sure that having independent counsels like Ken Starr or independent actors inside the executive branch of the federal government who can't be fired, for example, is a proper solution.
Okay. Do you think that happened in the last administration towards the end?
I think that Eric Holder and Loretta Lynch were both egregiously awful attorney generals who completely perverted the nature of the Department of Justice. Right. Yes.
And then let's say like the governors of the states were handling like the attorney general instead of like the actual president, so there is oversight there.
Well, again, the question is who can fire the attorney general at that point? Is it the governors of the state? Is it the legislature who can fire that person? Right now, the legislature could fire the attorney general. They'd have to impeach him. Right? He's approved by the Senate. So there are mechanisms there for it. Maybe the answer is that you have to make the burdens for impeachment actually lower. You have to lower the burdens for impeachment, make it easier to impeach people because that check has not been particularly effective throughout American history. That's an easier solution to me than using governors to select somebody completely independent of the federal executive branch.
Thank you.
First of all, thank you for coming, Ben. One question is that over the past several years, there's been, unfortunately, multiple mass shootings from the Pulse nightclub, Sandy Hook, and now most recently Parkland. Why now? Because in the past there was outrage, but it seems after the most recent Parkland, there's a lot of outrage directed specifically at the NRA. And why is it that it's happened now instead of in the past?
I mean, I think two things. One, I think some of it is astroturfed. I think that the media sense blood in the water. A couple of things. One, in 2012, when Sandy Hook happened, late 2012, the President of the United States was a Democrat. So it wasn't being used by the media as a club against the President of the United States. It was used by the media as a club against congressional Republicans. I remember I was there. It's when I had my rather infamous Piers Morgan debate on exactly this issue. So it was an issue after Sandy Hook. I think that these incidents that tend to drive the most attention are not just mass shootings, it's mass shootings of children, obviously. We saw the Las Vegas shooting, which was significantly more deadly than the Parkland shooting. We still don't know anything about what happened there. All that information is being withheld from us, and the media seems completely incurious about what happened there, but obviously Parkland is taken front and center because now you have all these high schoolers who are going out there and speaking, and they've been imbued with ultimate moral authority by the media, even if they don't know what the hell they're talking about. And you know, I find that an egregious misuse of media power. Just because you've gone through suffering doesn't mean you know what the hell you're talking about on any given issue. This is a pet peeve of mine. On every issue, this is a pet peeve of mine. I remember Jimmy Kimmel did this with his son, right? He brought out his son who had gone through a heart surgery, and he says, well, now let me rail about Obamacare. And I thought to myself, what absolute utter nonsense. My daughter went through a heart surgery at that hospital, same surgeon, open heart surgery. It didn't make me an expert on Obamacare. Studying Obamacare makes me an expert on Obamacare. So I mean, it's a point of irritation. But yeah, the media pick on these things because they know the hotter the issue, the more they're going to be able to milk it. And I think that they are ardent gun control advocates. I mean, they're not journalists, they're advocates at this point.
Thank you.
Hi, Ben. Love the life. Fantastic stuff. Ben, I was a former illegal immigrant as a child, and I'm an American and a patriot now. I'm also conservative.
Well, good for you. That's great.
What's that?
Good for you. That's awesome.
Appreciate
Welcome.
It. But what I was going to ask you is if you have, well, two questions, but if you have any ideas on how to roll people like myself into conservatism, and if there's a messaging problem with the GOP.
So I do think there's a messaging problem with illegal immigration in the GOP, and that is treating every illegal immigrant as exactly the same. I don't like treating classes of people as classes of people, meaning the idea that every illegal immigrant has to be deported, for example, I think is counterproductive. I think there are illegal immigrants serving in the military who we all be able to stay in the country and become citizens. I think that when it comes to the so-called dreamers, people were brought over here as kids through no fault of their own. I don't think that we ought to treat them as a class either by keeping everybody or deporting everybody. Meaning I think that what we ought to be doing is looking at it as a country and saying who's of net benefit to the United States, just the same way you would with a legal immigrant, and say who's of not net benefit to the United States. We get to pick and choose. And then I think that we ought to make clear to immigrants of all stripes that the reason America's great is because you immigrate here for America to be awesome. You immigrated here for our freedoms, not for the welfare programs, which is the reason most immigrants show up here, right? They're not showing up here to take advantage of the welfare programs by and large, statistically speaking. They're coming here because they actually want a better way of life. Now, one of the ways that we can make that happen is by actually minimizing the welfare systems that drive people to come and actually take advantage of those systems. Right, when my great-great-grandparents came here, there were virtually no immigration restrictions in the United States. They came over here in 1907, didn't speak English, had no money. And it was easy to assimilate people because if you didn't assimilate, then you were going to starve. Now, you came here, no one was going to give you a handout. You might have a local community willing to accept you, but that was about it. And you came here, and so what that meant is people who were coming here were risk seekers. They weren't coming here for a sense of safety and a sense of security. They were coming here because they wanted a riskier life, not a less risky life. They wanted to come here because they wanted to strive and they wanted to have a chance at really making something of themselves. That was the magnet that drew people here. When you change the magnet, you draw the type of people who are coming here. So I think that we need to change the magnet, and I also think that as a Republican Party, we need to, and as conservatives generally, we need to say to immigrants, the reason that you're coming here is because America is a free country, and we know that, and you know that, and that's why you ought to join us. And I do think that we need to cut out some of the more inflammatory statements about classifying all illegal immigrants along one line, because I don't think that's accurate. And maybe that's just the Californian in me talking, but that's the way, again, I know too many illegal immigrants who have come here and tried to work hard and make something of themselves, say all illegal immigrants are bad, and I know too many people who have been rear-ended in a fender bender by an illegal immigrant with no car insurance to say all illegal immigrants are great. Right? There is a difference between all people, legal immigrants, illegal immigrants, citizens, non-citizens. We need more good people here and less bad people here.
And I do need a tip from you. I've noticed that native-born Americans have a utopian standard when it comes to looking at America, and immigrants obviously have a real perspective on like an actual standard. And I find how do you fight in a discussion where people tend to embrace like a false equivalency or just generally believe that America is like a third world country just because Al Jazeera Plus keeps telling them that's the case?
That's part of the question.
I feel like a lot of people, particularly a lot of millennials, think that America is just terrible and dreadful and it's equivalent to Russia or to some other foreign country.
Right, yeah. I mean,
how do you fight that?
That's a product of an awful educational system that's been telling people since the 1960s that America's a terrible, horrible, awful place. It's a product of intersectional politics, which identifies people by their identity as opposed to their ideas. It's a product of a system that teaches people that American history is replete with horrors, but with no good, and that foundational principles that America was built on were built on these horrors. All that stuff is not true. There's terrible stuff in America's history, of course. But America was founded on the greatest ideals any nation was ever founded on, and the product is the greatest civilization in the history of mankind, which is why people want to come here and they don't want to leave. So it's a great irritant, obviously.
Hi, Ben. Ben as well. Ooh, last one, a lot of pressure. Okay, so one thing that you said, I'm in complete disagreement with you, and then another thing I just wanted to ask your opinion on it. The first thing, why do you think the deputy in the Parkland shooting was in the wrong and he didn't do anything? Speaking as a former member of a law enforcement agency, what, I don't mean to sound like mean, but what qualifications do you have to say that he did the wrong thing, and why are you calling him a coward when active shooter training is something that's just now being taught in the law enforcement communities over the past 3-4 years, and they're still figuring out how to teach it? And then once you answer that, I can get...
Okay, so First answer first. So one of two things happened, and we don't know the answer yet. Either the training was insufficient, in which case the sheriff, the Scott Israel, should be out on his ass, and that's his fault. Or Scott Israel is not lying, and this guy was trained and he did the wrong thing. Right? Those are the two options that are on the table. So I'm open to either option right now. I mean, yesterday on my show, I said it's very possible that this deputy did nothing wrong, and he was being told by his higher-ups that he was supposed to sit out there and do nothing. And that may, in fact, be a more plausible explanation, given the reports that there were 4 officers out there, not 1, which says to me that this wasn't just an officer, quote-unquote, chickening out. It was 4 officers who were probably told through protocol that they weren't supposed to go inside. But if the protocols taught that you were supposed to go inside and you didn't go inside, then you're paid for the job. And you know, listen, this is why I have outsized respect for members of law enforcement and members of the military, because I didn't have the balls to do that. Right? I have outsized respect for people who sign up for that job. But when you sign up for that job, obviously it comes along with the job description. If you don't fulfill the job description, then you failed. So that's the breakdown there.
Okay. The next thing I wanted to ask, I do want to say you brought up a lot of good points. Next thing I wanted to ask, or just kind of get your opinion on, what do you think about the NFA of 1934, which is the National Firearms Act of 1934, which basically regulated the interstate transport and somewhat banned the usage of machine guns, short-barreled rifles, short-barreled shotguns, and, quote, any other weapons under what it defines as Title II of the NFA?
So I have significant problems with the National Firearms Act, and neither, by the way, does the NRA. Even the NRA doesn't argue with the banning of machine guns. That's pretty uncontroversial at this point.
Okay, cool.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Well, thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate you having me. You're wonderful. I look forward to coming back.
Just some quick closing remarks for everyone. Please exit through the doors that you entered through at the southwest entrance and use the same sidewalks for returning as you did coming here. Volunteers, please meet at the back of the room. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you to all our business sponsors, all of our volunteers, especially those with the Young Americans Foundation, University of Nebraska, Omaha. Have a safe night, and everyone drive home safe.
And big government sucks.
I think he said big government sucks.
Testing. Okay, one last announcement. Everyone, if you go to any high school, any college, and you want to get involved with Turning Point USA, which is the lovely organization that just brought Ben Shapiro to you, yes, go to turningpointusa.com, fill out a Get Involved form there, and someone from one of our chapters will be in contact with you. Also, any young women in the audience, go apply for Young Women's Leadership Summit. That's this June. Any other conferences, check out our homepage. We have a ton of information and ways for everyone to get involved. Thank you so much.